Introduction. History is full of grand visions. Projects so bold and ambitious that, if completed, they might have reshaped the world we live in today. Yet many of them were left unfinished, abandoned, or forgotten. In this video, we'll explore some of the most fascinating unfinished projects that could have changed history forever. The Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel remains one of the most iconic unfinished projects in human imagination. A structure that, according to the biblical tradition, was meant to reach the heavens. While historians debate its historical accuracy, the story has persisted for centuries as a symbol of both human ambition and the limits of human cooperation. The account of the Tower of Babel appears in the Book of Genesis, where it is described as a construction project undertaken by the people of Mesopotamia. In the generations after the Great Flood, humanity was said to have been united in language and purpose. They chose to build a city and within it a monumental tower. The intent, according to the text, was not only practical but symbolic. To create a structure so high that it would reach the skies, ensuring the people's fame and unity, and preventing their scattering across the earth. The imagery of this tower is powerful. In Mesopotamian culture, ziggurats, step temple towers, were already an architectural tradition. They served as connections between the earth and the divine. The Tower of Babel may have drawn inspiration from these structures, taking the form of an immense ziggurat, constructed of sun-baked bricks and bitumen. If built as intended, it would have been one of the largest structures of the ancient world, a project that combined religious aspiration with engineering ambition. According to the biblical account, however, the construction was never completed. The reason given is that divine intervention interrupted the work. As the builders toiled, their once unified language was confused, creating a multitude of tongues. Suddenly, cooperation became impossible. Workers could no longer understand one another, and the great project collapsed under the weight of its own miscommunication. The people scattered, abandoning the unfinished tower, leaving it as a symbol of unrealized ambition. From a historical perspective, the Tower of Babel has often been linked to actual ruins in Mesopotamia, most notably the Etemenanke ziggurat in Babylon. This structure, dedicated to the god Marduk, stood as a massive step tower that reached extraordinary heights for its time. Archaeological evidence suggests that such towers were indeed partially destroyed, rebuilt, and abandoned over centuries, providing a possible historical foundation for the biblical story. Yet whether the Tower of Babel itself was a single, real structure or a mythological representation, its presence in cultural memory has been profound. What makes the Tower of Babel such an important unfinished project is the scale of its ambition. It was not merely a tower, but an attempt to transcend earthly limits. It represented the idea that human beings could build together toward the divine. The failure of the project is equally symbolic. It embodies the fragility of communication and cooperation, the way unity can fracture, and how even the greatest vision can remain incomplete. The Tower of Babel has since inspired countless interpretations, from medieval commentaries to modern works of literature and art. Painters, poets, and architects have revisited its image, often portraying it as a spiraling, monumental structure disappearing into the clouds. In each portrayal, the sense of awe is balanced with a sense of futility. The unfinished tower looms as a monument not to human achievement, but to the impossibility of perfect unity. For centuries, the Tower of Babel has been used as a metaphor for division, linguistic diversity, and the challenges of globalization. In some ways, its legacy is larger than the structure itself could ever have been. By not being completed, it achieved a different kind of immortality, a permanent reminder of humanity's unfulfilled projects, an emblem of both our creative drive and our inability to overcome certain limits. In the story of unfinished projects that might have changed history, the Tower of Babel stands at the very beginning. Had it been completed, it might have reshaped the cultural and religious imagination of the ancient world. Instead, it became something else. An enduring legend of ambition halted, a story of cooperation undone, and a reminder that sometimes what remains unfinished carries more weight than what is built to completion. Tatlin's Tower. In the years following the Russian Revolution, artists and architects searched for new forms to express the birth of a new society. Among these visions, one stood out as both ambitious and impossible: Tatlin's Tower, officially known as the Monument to the Third International. Conceived in 1919 by the avant-garde artist and architect Vladimir Tatlin, this project was designed to embody the ideals of the new Soviet world. Although it was never built, its image continues to symbolize the intersection of utopia, politics, and modern design. The tower was planned as an enormous spiral of iron and steel, rising higher than the Eiffel Tower. Its proposed height was 400 meters, making it one of the tallest structures of its time if completed. But beyond sheer scale, the design itself was revolutionary. Instead of a traditional vertical tower, Tatlin envisioned a vast, leaning helix, with its steel frame twisting upward in a dynamic form. Inside the structure, 3 large glass geometrical shapes were to be suspended: a cube, a pyramid, and a cylinder. Each of these forms had a practical and symbolic function. The cube at the base would serve as a meeting hall for international gatherings. Above it, the pyramid was to house executive offices. At the top, the cylinder was planned as a center for information, broadcasting news to the world. Each form would rotate at a different rate: the cube once per year, the pyramid once per month, and the cylinder once per day. This movement was meant to symbolize the rhythm of progress, the constant revolution of human society, and the dynamic character of the new age. The structure was not only architectural but ideological. Tatlin and his contemporaries believed that art and engineering could be fused to serve a collective purpose. The tower was meant to be both a headquarters for the Communist International and a monument to a new world order. Its spiraling design suggested upward growth, unity, and endless development. In its ambition, it echoed ancient monuments such as the Tower of Babel, but reimagined through the lens of industrial modernity. Yet from the beginning, the project faced insurmountable challenges. The Russia of 1919 was in turmoil, with civil war, famine, and economic collapse. The idea of constructing a tower larger than the Eiffel Tower, entirely from steel and glass, was beyond the material capacity of the time. Even if resources had been available, the engineering difficulties were immense. A structure of such height, with rotating components weighing thousands of tons, was far ahead of contemporary technology. Engineers who studied the project later concluded that it could not have been built with the methods and materials of the early 20th century. Nevertheless, Tatlin's Tower was not forgotten. Models were created and displayed in exhibitions in Moscow and Petrograd, inspiring generations of artists and architects. The tower came to represent the artistic movement known as constructivism, which emphasized functional design, industrial materials, and the integration of art into everyday life. Even in its unfinished state, it shaped the course of modern architecture, pointing toward a future that combined form, function, and ideology. The cultural impact of Tatlin's Tower extends far beyond its unrealized construction. For the Soviet state, it became a propaganda tool, illustrating the ambition and creativity of the revolution. For artists around the world, it was a symbol of radical possibility, showing how architecture could break from traditional forms and embrace abstract, dynamic shapes. The spiral frame and suspended geometries inspired later experiments in design, from avant-garde sculptures to modern skyscrapers. Yet, at the same time, its very impossibility gave it a different kind of legacy. The failure to build Tatlin's Tower reflects the gap between utopian vision and material reality. It highlights how art can project ideas that exceed the limits of society's capacity to realize them. The tower exists today in photographs, sketches, and scale models, preserved as a dream of modernity that was never made real. For historians, Tatlin's Tower is a reminder of the early Soviet Union's bold experimentation, when art and politics were intertwined in radical ways. It marks a moment when architecture was not only about shelter or aesthetics but about imagining the future of humanity. The tower's spiraling form remains striking even by today's standards, suggesting energy, motion, and endless ascent. The project's unfinished status adds to its aura. Like the Tower of Babel centuries earlier, it represents ambition halted before completion. But while Babel became a tale of divine intervention and human limitation, Tatlin's Tower became a story of technological and social boundaries, a project too large for the world it was born into. Its absence in the physical landscape only increases its presence in the cultural imagination. Today, Tatlin's tower is studied not as a failed building, but as a successful idea. It never rose above the streets of Petrograd, yet it shaped how people think about architecture, politics, and utopian ambition. Its spiraling steel frame exists in drawings and models, reminding us that unfinished projects can sometimes leave deeper marks than completed ones. The monument to the Third International was never constructed, but it became one of the most enduring symbols of the 20th century's vision of transformation. In the story of unfinished projects that could have changed history, Tatlin's tower occupies a unique place. It was not destroyed or abandoned mid-construction. Instead, it was halted before it began, existing as a design that captured the revolutionary imagination. In that sense, it achieved something rare. It became legendary not for what it was, but for what it was meant to be. Its spiral continues to rise, not in steel and glass, but in memory and imagination. The Temple of Apollo at Naxos. On the island of Naxos, in the heart of the Aegean Sea, stand the remains of an ancient vision that was never realized. Known today as the Temple of Apollo, this unfinished project has endured for more than 2 millennia as both ruin and symbol. The most visible remnant is a massive marble gateway, called the Port Era, which still rises against the backdrop of sea and sky. Though the temple was never completed, the fragment that survives carries with it the weight of ambition, history, and myth. Construction of the temple began in the 6th century BCE, during the period when Naxos was one of the most powerful islands in the Cyclades. Under the rule of the tyrant Lygdamis, the island experienced a surge of wealth and influence. To mark this power, Lygdamis ordered the construction of a sanctuary that would surpass all others in scale and grandeur. The temple was dedicated to Apollo, the god of light, music, and prophecy, but some scholars believe it may originally have been intended for Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, who was also deeply associated with Naxos. The design reflected the ambition of the time. The temple was planned on an enormous platform, with dimensions that exceeded many of the great sanctuaries of Greece. It was intended to be built entirely of marble, a material abundant on Naxos and prized throughout the ancient world. Each block was quarried from the island's own mountains, cut with remarkable precision, and transported toward the coast. The Port Era, the surviving gateway, alone measures more than 6 meters in height and 7 meters in width, with each lintel stone weighing many tons. Yet, despite the resources and vision, the project was never completed. Scholars suggest several reasons for this. The political fortunes of Lygdamis declined, and with his downfall, funding and support for the construction collapsed. Shifting alliances and conflicts in the Aegean may also have played a role. Without a patron to sustain the immense effort, the project fell silent, leaving only its beginnings as a testament to unrealized ambition. Over time, the incomplete temple took on new meanings. The massive gateway, still standing, became known as the Port Era, meaning Great Door. It faces directly toward the sacred island of Delos, birthplace of Apollo, suggesting its intended religious alignment. But as centuries passed, the structure was repurposed. Stones from the unfinished temple were reused in other buildings, including a nearby Venetian castle during the Middle Ages. Yet the Port Era itself resisted destruction, too heavy and too monumental to be dismantled. What remains today is both fragment and monument. Tourists who arrive in Naxos often walk across a narrow causeway to reach the Port Era, where the marble frame rises starkly against the horizon. The sight is striking. An enormous doorway that leads nowhere, a portal that opens only to the sea and the sky. Its incompleteness is what gives it such resonance. It invites reflection on the scale of ancient ambition, the fragility of human projects, and the enduring presence of what is left unfinished. The Temple of Apollo at Naxos demonstrates how incompletion can transform meaning. If the temple had been finished, it would have stood as another grand sanctuary among the many in Greece. Its columns, roof, and decorations would have told stories of devotion and power. But by remaining unfinished, it carries a different kind of story. It tells of a project interrupted by history, of grandeur that never reached its full form, and of the endurance of fragments that outlive their creators. The port era has also absorbed layers of myth. Some traditions associate it with Ariadne, the princess of Crete who, according to legend, was abandoned on Naxos by Theseus before being taken by Dionysus. Others see in the gateway a symbolic threshold between the human and the divine. Whether connected to Apollo or Dionysus, the incomplete temple became a backdrop for myths that stretch beyond its physical stones. From an archaeological perspective, the unfinished temple reveals much about the construction methods of the ancient Greeks. The massive marble blocks bear marks of quarrying and transport. Their sheer scale demonstrates the technical abilities of the Naxians, who managed to move and position stones weighing dozens of tons without advanced machinery. The fact that such a project could even be attempted speaks to the wealth and ambition of the island in the 6th century BCE. And yet, it remains unfinished. This incompletion transforms the site into something more contemplative than triumphant. Standing before the port era, one is struck not only by the size of the stones but by the silence of the project itself, the sense of work left undone. The temple was meant to embody the permanence of divine worship and political power. Instead, it embodies impermanence, change, and the limits of human endeavor. In the long story of unfinished projects, the Temple of Apollo at Naxos stands as a reminder of how history reshapes architecture. What was once intended as a complete sanctuary is now a single monumental frame. What was meant to demonstrate power became a ruin that reflects fragility. Its incompletion has given it a poetic presence that perhaps a finished temple would never have achieved. Today, the port era is one of the most recognizable landmarks of Naxos, photographed by countless visitors, framed by sunsets over the Aegean. It no longer functions as a temple, nor as a political statement. Instead, it serves as a reminder of human ambition, the passing of time, and the endurance of the unfinished. Like other projects that could have changed history, it suggests that sometimes what remains incomplete becomes the most lasting of all. Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines. Among the many unfinished projects that mark the history of human imagination, few are as fascinating as Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines. Leonardo, the quintessential Renaissance thinker, left behind notebooks filled with sketches, diagrams, and ideas that reached far beyond the capabilities of his time. In those pages, he imagined devices that could lift humans into the air, imitating the flight of birds. Though none of these designs were realized in his lifetime, they remain some of the most remarkable examples of visionary ambition that never took flight. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452, at a time when Europe was experiencing a revival of science, art, and philosophy. He worked as a painter, engineer, and inventor, combining observation of nature with technical curiosity. Flight, in particular, captured his imagination. From an early age, he observed the movement of birds, noting how wings generated lift and how air resistance could be manipulated. He believed that by understanding the mechanics of flight in nature, humans might one day achieve the same. His notebooks contain numerous designs for flying machines. One of the most famous is the ornithopter, a device with large, bat-like wings intended to flap up and down as the pilot pulled levers and pedals. The design closely followed the anatomy of birds, with a central frame for the pilot and long, jointed wings stretching outward. Leonardo believed that by imitating nature directly, humans could achieve controlled flight. However, the materials and strength of the human body were not sufficient to make such a machine practical. Another design was the aerial screw, often compared to the modern helicopter. It consisted of a large helical surface made of linen, reinforced with reeds and rotated by manpower. Leonardo theorized that if the screw were turned fast enough, it would create lift and rise into the air. While the principle was imaginative, it lacked the power source necessary to generate sufficient speed. It was not until centuries later, with the invention of engines, that vertical flight became possible. Leonardo also sketched gliders, parachutes, and various devices for controlling air resistance. His design for a parachute consisted of a pyramid-shaped canopy of cloth, held open by a wooden frame. He described it as a way for a man to jump from great heights safely. Modern tests of this design, centuries later, have shown that it could indeed function. In this sense, Leonardo's unfinished work was not entirely impractical. It was simply waiting for the right materials and conditions to be tested. What makes Leonardo's flying machines significant is not that they were completed, but that they were conceived at all. In the 15th century, there was no aviation, no engines, and little understanding of aerodynamics. Yet Leonardo approached the problem with scientific observation and artistic imagination. He dissected birds to study their muscles, recorded air currents, and even speculated on the importance of balance and control during flight. His notebooks reveal a mind centuries ahead of its time, bridging the gap between art and engineering. Despite his brilliance, Leonardo never built a working flying machine. There is little evidence that he even attempted full-scale prototypes of most designs. The challenges of weight, materials, and human strength were too great. Wood and cloth could not provide the lightness and durability needed, and without engines, the dream of powered flight remained impossible. In this sense, his machines were destined to remain unfinished, confined to drawings and ideas rather than physical reality. Yet their unfinished status has given them enduring power. Today, Leonardo's sketches are studied not as failed projects but as visions of what might come. They demonstrate the potential of imagination to leap far beyond the practical limits of the present. By trying to design flying machines, Leonardo anticipated the principles of aerodynamics and mechanics that would only be fully understood centuries later. His failure to complete the project does not diminish its importance. Rather, it shows how ideas can outlive their immediate usefulness and inspire future generations. The legacy of Leonardo's flying machines is visible in the history of aviation. When flight was finally achieved in the early 20th century, inventors such as the Wright brothers shared a similar spirit of observation, experimentation, and persistence. Leonardo's work did not lead directly to modern aircraft, but it provided a symbolic foundation. The belief that human beings could study nature and adapt its principles to new inventions. His notebooks, filled with sketches of wings, screws, and gliders, became icons of creativity unbounded by time. In the story of unfinished projects that could have changed history, Leonardo's flying machines stand out as dreams written on paper. They were never built, never tested in his lifetime, and never proved in practice. Yet they changed history in another way. By showing the world that flight was imaginable, that the sky was not unreachable, and that human ambition could extend beyond the earth. The unfinished nature of his work allowed it to live as inspiration rather than as a single, fixed achievement. Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines remain among the most enduring examples of human imagination outpacing material reality. They are monuments not of stone or steel, but of ink and thought, suspended between possibility and impossibility. They remind us that unfinished projects can shape the future, not by their completion, but by the visions they leave behind. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower. At the dawn of the 20th century, as electricity transformed the modern world, Nikola Tesla envisioned a system that would make energy limitless and wireless. His most ambitious project, the Wardenclyffe Tower, was meant to transmit power through the earth and atmosphere without the need for wires. Rising from the fields of Long Island, New York, the unfinished structure became both a monument to human ambition and a reminder of the fragility of visionary projects. The idea behind Wardenclyffe emerged from Tesla's experiments with high-voltage electricity and resonance. He had already astonished audiences with demonstrations of wireless lighting, electric motors, and oscillating currents. By the late 1890s, Tesla began to believe that energy itself could be transmitted through the Earth using natural frequencies. His vision was not only to send messages, as with the emerging technology of radio, but to transmit electrical power across great distances. In his view, a single global system of towers could provide energy to any place on Earth, freely and abundantly. In 1901, Tesla secured funding from financier J.P. Morgan to construct the first prototype of this system. The chosen site was Shoreham, Long Island, where construction began on a massive tower 57 meters high, topped with a copper dome weighing 55 tons. Beneath the surface, a shaft extended deep into the ground, anchoring the structure and providing a channel for electrical conduction through the earth. The tower was connected to a laboratory building designed by the architect Stanford White, a hub where Tesla conducted his experiments. Tesla envisioned Wardenclyffe as the beginning of a global network. The tower was to serve multiple purposes: transmitting wireless telegraphy, distributing electric power, and eventually enabling worldwide communication. In Tesla's words, it would eliminate wires, reduce costs, and make energy available to anyone, anywhere. The scale of the idea was staggering, suggesting a transformation of civilization itself. Yet from the start, the project faced difficulties. The cost of construction was high, and Tesla's experiments demanded vast amounts of energy. While he believed in the feasibility of wireless power transmission, the scientific community remained skeptical. The physics of the time was not fully developed, and Tesla's explanations, rooted in his unique theories of resonance and earth conduction, were difficult for others to replicate. Investors grew concerned, particularly as Guglielmo Marconi achieved success in wireless telegraphy using simpler, more practical methods. By 1903, J.P. Morgan withdrew further financial support, leaving Tesla without the resources to complete his vision. Construction on Wardenclyffe slowed, and though the tower stood, it never functioned as intended. Tesla continued to refine his theories, insisting that the system could work if properly developed, but the lack of funding and the rise of competing technologies left him isolated. In 1917, during World War I, the U.S. government ordered the tower dismantled, fearing it could be used by enemy forces. Its steel frame was torn down, leaving only fragments of the foundation and the surrounding laboratory. The story of Wardenclyffe Tower did not end with its demolition. For decades, it has remained a symbol of unrealized potential. Some see it as evidence of Tesla's genius, cut short by lack of support and the priorities of industry. Others view it as a project that was simply too far ahead of its time, based on theories that lacked sufficient experimental proof. Regardless of interpretation, the image of the unfinished tower continues to inspire fascination. Wardenclyffe's legacy extends into modern discussions of energy and technology. The idea of wireless power, while not realized on the scale Tesla imagined, is now present in small forms, from charging devices to transmitting limited amounts of energy over short distances. In this sense, Tesla's vision anticipated developments that would only emerge a century later. His dream of global wireless energy remains unfulfilled, but the concept itself continues to shape imagination and research. What makes Wardenclyffe Tower one of the great unfinished projects is its combination of physical presence and unrealized purpose. The tower stood, but its function was never achieved. It became an incomplete monument, half built in steel and copper, half existing in the mind of its creator. Unlike a failed experiment hidden from view, Wardenclyffe was visible to all, a towering reminder of a project that aimed to change the world and instead collapsed under its own ambition. Today, the remains of the site still exist on Long Island, preserved as a historical landmark. Visitors can see the grounds where Tesla worked, imagining the tower that once rose into the sky. Its story illustrates how visionary projects can falter, not because the vision lacks power, but because the world around them is not ready to sustain them. In the larger story of unfinished projects that might have changed history, Wardenclyffe Tower stands as one of the most striking. It represents the daring imagination of Nikola Tesla, who believed that energy could be shared across the earth as easily as messages. Its incompletion reflects both the limits of technology at the time and the complexities of finance, politics, and belief. Like many unfinished projects, it achieved a different kind of success. It became a legend, a symbol of the power of ideas that remain just out of reach. Germania, Welthauptstadt, Germania. In the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler and his chief architect Albert Speer began to imagine a capital city unlike any the world had ever seen. They called it Germania, the world capital, a city meant to embody the permanence and grandeur of the Third Reich. The plan was to transform Berlin into a monumental center of power, one that would rival and surpass Rome, Paris, and even ancient capitals of empire. The project, vast in scope and ambition, was never realized, but the fragments left behind tell the story of a city that existed only in plans and partial foundations. The vision for Germania was rooted in symbolism. Hitler saw architecture as a tool for shaping memory and authority. He believed that buildings should not merely serve functional purposes but should project power for centuries. Inspired by Roman imperial monuments, he wanted structures that would awe citizens and visitors alike. Speer, a young and talented architect, took on the task of translating this vision into stone, steel, and marble. At the heart of Germania was to stand the Volkshalle, or People's Hall. This structure, if completed, would have been the largest enclosed building in the world. Designed as a colossal domed hall capable of holding 180,000 people, it would rise more than 300 meters high, dwarfing St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The dome itself was so massive that some engineers questioned whether it could even stand, given the limits of construction materials of the time. Inside, the hall would serve as the ultimate stage for political ceremonies, a place where the regime could gather the masses under one roof, surrounded by symbols of unity and control. Another centerpiece was the Triumphal Arch, modeled on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris but far larger. Speer's design called for an arch 117 meters high and 170 meters wide, so immense that the Parisian original could have fit entirely within its opening. It was to be adorned with the names of Germany's war dead, carved into stone on a monumental scale. This arch would stand at the end of a vast new north-south axis, a grand boulevard stretching through Berlin, lined with buildings designed to impress through sheer size and order. Construction on Germania began in small but symbolic steps. Entire neighborhoods of Berlin were demolished to make way for the new boulevards. In the late 1930s, workers cleared land and relocated residents, with thousands forced from their homes. Granite was quarried in massive quantities, much of it by forced labor. The foundations for some structures were laid, including a large concrete testing platform known as the Schwerbelastungskörper, built to measure how Berlin's sandy soil would bear the weight of colossal buildings. This cylinder of reinforced concrete still exists today, a reminder of the ambitions that once loomed over the city. The outbreak of World War II shifted priorities. Resources, labor, and industry were redirected toward the war effort, slowing progress on Germania. Speer continued to refine designs, and some small-scale projects were carried out, but the grand structures themselves remained incomplete. As the war dragged on, the dream of Germania became increasingly unrealistic. Allied bombings devastated Berlin, and by 1945, the city was in ruins, the opposite of the imperial capital that had been imagined. Germania never rose from the drawing board, but its plans reveal much about the ambitions of the Nazi regime. It was not merely about architecture. It was about reshaping the identity of a nation and projecting its power outward to the world. The city was to be a statement of permanence, declaring that the Third Reich would last 1,000 years. Its incompletion, and the eventual defeat of the regime, turned those grand designs into relics of hubris. Today, the traces of Germania can still be found. The Schwerbelastungskörper remains in Berlin, preserved as a historical monument. Some granite quarries used for its construction survive, bearing silent witness to the forced labor that extracted the stone. Architectural models and drawings of Germania are displayed in museums, where visitors can see what might have been. A city of impossible scale, designed not for human comfort but for political spectacle. Germania belongs among the great unfinished projects that could have changed history, not because it promised technological progress or cultural enrichment, but because it symbolized the attempt to impose ideology on an entire landscape. Had it been completed, the architecture of Berlin would today bear a radically different face, its skyline dominated by massive domes and arches. Instead, its absence tells a different story, that even the grandest visions can collapse when they are built on violence and destruction. In the end, Germania remained unfinished not due to lack of imagination, but because its foundation was inseparable from war, oppression, and the illusion of permanence. What survives is not the city itself, but its shadow, a reminder of how architecture can be used to dream of power, and how unfinished projects can stand as silent counterpoints to history that might have been. The Soviet Lunar Program. In the years following the Second World War, the Soviet Union and the United States found themselves locked in a new kind of struggle, not over territory or armies, but over the skies above. This rivalry, later called the space race, became a defining element of the 20th century. The Soviet Union, which had stunned the world with the launch of Sputnik in 1957 and the first human spaceflight by Yuri Gagarin in 1961, set its sights on the moon. The plan was simple in ambition but immense in complexity: to land a Soviet cosmonaut on the lunar surface before the Americans. Yet the program, despite its early triumphs and enormous effort, remained unfinished. It ended not with a landing, but with silence, as history remembered only the footsteps of Apollo. The Soviet lunar program began with momentum. Under the leadership of chief designer Sergei Korolev, the USSR developed a series of increasingly advanced spacecraft. The Luna probes achieved milestones that astonished the world. Luna 2 became the first human-made object to impact the moon in 1959. Luna 3 sent back the first photographs of the moon's far side, and Luna 9 achieved the first soft landing in 1966. Each success demonstrated Soviet ingenuity and placed pressure on the United States. Yet landing humans on the moon was an altogether greater challenge. To accomplish this, the Soviets designed the N-1 rocket, a massive launch vehicle intended to rival the American Saturn V. Standing 105 meters tall, the N-1 was a marvel of ambition. Powered by 30 engines in its first stage, it was designed to lift over 90 tons into orbit. If successful, it would carry the L-3 lunar spacecraft, including a lander capable of placing a single cosmonaut on the moon's surface. The complexity of the N-1, however, became the program's undoing. Unlike the Saturn V, which used fewer but more powerful engines, the Soviet approach relied on clustering many smaller engines. Coordinating their performance required a level of control technology that was difficult to achieve with the electronics of the 1960s. Between 1969 and 1972, 4 test launches of the N-1 all ended in failure, with explosions that destroyed the rocket before it could leave Earth's atmosphere. The most catastrophic occurred in July 1969, just weeks before Apollo 11 succeeded. The failure erased any possibility of catching up. Compounding these technical difficulties was the loss of Sergei Korolev in 1966. His death deprived the program of its most capable leader, and rivalries within the Soviet space industry deepened. Different design bureaus competed for influence, resources were spread thin, and coordination faltered. While the Americans concentrated their efforts on a single clear objective, the Soviet program pursued multiple directions at once: lunar orbiters, robotic landers, and the human lunar landing project. The result was fragmentation and delay. By the time the United States achieved its first lunar landing in July 1969, the Soviet Union's human program was already behind schedule. Publicly, the USSR emphasized the successes of its robotic lunar missions, which continued into the 1970s and brought back soil samples with automated landers. These accomplishments were impressive in their own right, but they could not match the symbolic power of a human presence on the moon. The political momentum that had driven the program began to fade. In the early 1970s, the Soviet leadership quietly ended the effort. The remaining N-1 rockets were dismantled, and the dream of a cosmonaut planting the red flag on the lunar surface remained unrealized. Resources were redirected toward other projects, including space stations such as Salyut and later Mir. While these efforts advanced human presence in orbit, the moon itself was left to American footprints and memory. The unfinished Soviet lunar program remains one of the most striking what-ifs in modern history. Had it succeeded, the balance of prestige in the space race might have been different. A Soviet landing would have altered the narrative of technological leadership during the Cold War. Yet its incompletion reflects deeper truths: that vision alone cannot overcome the limits of technology, coordination, and time. Today, fragments of the program remain in museums and archives. Scale models of the N-1 rocket can be seen, and the surviving photographs of test launches bear witness to both ambition and failure. Engineers and historians still study the designs, noting both their ingenuity and their flaws. The robotic lunar missions, often overshadowed, remind us that the Soviets achieved many firsts, even if the final prize eluded them. The story of the Soviet lunar program belongs among the unfinished projects that could have changed history, not only because of what it failed to achieve, but because of how close it came. It represents the intersection of vision, politics, and human ambition, set against the vast backdrop of space. Its silence on the moon is not a sign of insignificance, but of how history is shaped as much by what is absent as by what remains. Hughes H-4 Hercules. During the height of the Second World War, the United States faced a logistical challenge unlike any before. Millions of soldiers, vehicles, and supplies had to cross the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, sinking thousands of tons of shipping. Cargo ships were vulnerable, slow, and costly in both material and lives. Out of this crisis came an idea that seemed almost impossible. A flying ship so vast that it could carry hundreds of soldiers or even tanks across oceans, beyond the reach of submarines. That vision became the Hughes H-4 Hercules, later nicknamed the Spruce Goose. The concept was born from a partnership between the industrialist Henry Kaiser, known for mass-producing Liberty ships, and the eccentric aviation pioneer Howard Hughes. Together, they proposed an aircraft that would solve the wartime shipping crisis. It would not be an ordinary airplane, but a flying vessel of unprecedented scale, the largest aircraft ever attempted. Hughes, whose reputation as an innovator was already legendary, took on the challenge of designing and constructing this extraordinary craft. The Hughes H-4 Hercules was conceived as a massive flying boat. To bypass restrictions on the use of metals, which were reserved for combat aircraft and weapons, Hughes designed the Hercules almost entirely out of wood. Despite its nickname, it was not made from spruce but primarily from birch, carefully laminated and shaped through a process called duramold. This material gave the aircraft both strength and lightness, though skeptics doubted whether wood could ever serve as the basis for something of such unprecedented scale. The planned dimensions of the H-4 were staggering. Its wingspan stretched over 97 meters, longer than a football field, making it the widest aircraft ever built at the time. Its height reached 24 meters, with a tail taller than a 7-story building. 8 massive radial engines were mounted along the wings, each capable of delivering thousands of horsepower. The Hercules was designed to carry 750 troops or 2 Sherman tanks across the ocean, lifting loads that no aircraft had ever attempted before. Yet the very ambition that defined the project also became its greatest obstacle. Constructing such an immense aircraft out of wood required meticulous craftsmanship and constant innovation. Each piece of the frame and each layer of laminated birch had to be fitted with precision. Progress was slow, and critics grew impatient. Many questioned the feasibility of the project, calling it a waste of resources. The U.S. government, which had originally supported the effort with contracts, grew skeptical as costs rose and deadlines slipped. By 1944, the war was turning in favor of the Allies. The threat from German U-boats lessened, and conventional shipping methods improved. The urgency that had justified the Hercules project began to fade. Henry Kaiser withdrew from the partnership, leaving Hughes to continue the project largely alone. For him, the Hercules had become more than a wartime solution. It was a personal quest, a demonstration of his genius and his refusal to accept limits. After the war ended in 1945, the need for the Hercules had evaporated entirely. Yet Hughes refused to abandon it. He poured his own fortune into completing the aircraft, determined to prove his critics wrong. The project became increasingly controversial, with Congress launching investigations into its spiraling costs and lack of results. Hughes defended himself passionately, insisting that the Hercules was not a failure but a testament to American innovation. At last, in 1947, the H-4 Hercules was rolled out in Long Beach, California. The aircraft stunned all who saw it, its enormous wings stretching across the hangar like the ribs of some mythic creature. On November 2nd of that year, Hughes himself took the controls for its one and only flight. Before a crowd of journalists and skeptics, the Hercules taxied across the water, lifted briefly into the air, and flew for just over 1 mile at an altitude of 21 meters. It was a short flight, but it proved that the aircraft could, in fact, fly. After that single demonstration, the Hercules never flew again. Hughes insisted that it remain ready for service, keeping it preserved in a climate-controlled hangar, maintained by a dedicated crew at great expense. For decades, the aircraft stood as a silent monument to ambition. Critics dismissed it as a white elephant, a useless relic of wartime imagination. Admirers, however, saw it as a masterpiece of engineering, proof that the boundaries of possibility could be stretched, even if not fully realized. The story of the H-4 Hercules is not simply about whether it succeeded or failed. In practical terms, it did not transform transportation, nor did it change the course of the war. Its vast size and wooden construction made it a technological dead end, overshadowed by advances in metal aircraft and jet propulsion. Yet its significance lies in what it represented. A moment when human ambition, facing the dire pressures of war, reached beyond conventional limits. Today, the Hercules survives as a museum piece in Oregon, carefully preserved for visitors to witness. Standing before it, one cannot help but feel its scale, the sheer improbability of a wooden aircraft so immense, designed to lift tanks and armies across oceans. It embodies both the grandeur of imagination and the fragility of execution. As one of history's great unfinished projects, the Hughes H-4 Hercules illustrates how ambition can produce creations that live more in memory than in utility. It was meant to reshape wartime logistics and redefine aviation, but instead it became a symbol of human daring, a singular machine that proved flight was possible, even if only once. In its unfinished role, the Spruce Goose remains not a failure, but a reminder that sometimes the act of reaching beyond the possible leaves a legacy as enduring as success itself. Atlantropa Project. In the 1920s, as Europe rebuilt itself after the devastation of the First World War, a German architect named Hermann Sorgel conceived of a project so vast that it would have reshaped entire continents. He called it Atlantropa. The idea was nothing less than to redesign the geography of the Mediterranean region, harness its waters for energy, and create new land to support civilization. It was a utopian vision, born from the optimism of engineering and the belief that humanity could solve its problems with monumental construction. Yet Atlantropa was never realized. It remained an ambitious dream on paper, an unfinished project that, if completed, might have transformed both Europe and Africa. The central element of Atlantropa was a proposal to build a giant dam across the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Mediterranean Sea. By partially closing off the strait, Sorgel believed that the inflow of Atlantic water could be controlled. Over time, evaporation would cause the level of the Mediterranean to drop by up to 200 meters. This lowering would expose vast new tracts of land along the coasts, creating millions of hectares of fertile territory for agriculture, industry, and settlement. But the Gibraltar Dam was only the beginning. Sorgel imagined additional dams across the Dardanelles, separating the Mediterranean from the Black Sea, and across the Suez Canal, further regulating water flow. He also proposed constructing hydroelectric power plants on a massive scale, which would generate electricity by exploiting the difference in water levels. These power stations, he believed, could supply abundant energy to all of Europe, ending dependence on coal and fostering a new era of peace and prosperity. Atlantropa was more than an engineering scheme, it was a geopolitical vision. Sorgel believed that by physically uniting Europe and Africa through new land bridges and shared infrastructure, a vast supercontinent could emerge. He imagined new cities rising on reclaimed land, highways and railways linking Europe to Africa, and the Sahara Desert transformed by irrigation into fertile farmland. In his mind, Atlantropa would not only solve the problems of overpopulation and energy scarcity but also prevent wars, since nations bound together by geography and shared resources would have no choice but to cooperate. The scope of the project was staggering, and so too were the challenges. Lowering the Mediterranean would have required moving unimaginable volumes of water and dealing with the displacement of entire ecosystems. Coastal cities such as Venice, Alexandria, and others would have been drastically altered or left stranded far from the new shoreline. The Nile River Delta, deprived of its balance with the Mediterranean, could have faced severe environmental consequences. Critics pointed out that the project underestimated the complexity of hydrology, climate, and geology. Despite the criticisms, Sorgel campaigned tirelessly for Atlantropa throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and into the post-war years. He published books, created detailed maps and models, and sought support from governments and international organizations. The League of Nations was one of his targets, as he believed Atlantropa could be a unifying project for all of Europe. Yet enthusiasm remained limited. The costs were astronomical, the engineering feasibility uncertain, and the political will lacking. The Second World War further pushed Atlantropa into obscurity. After 1945, when Europe was divided by the Cold War, the project appeared even less realistic. Neither side of the divided continent was willing to devote resources to a visionary scheme of such magnitude. By the time of Sorgel's death in 1952, Atlantropa had become a forgotten dream. His followers attempted to keep the idea alive, but it gradually faded into history, remembered mostly as an audacious proposal that never advanced beyond drawings and discussions. Today, Atlantropa stands as one of the most ambitious, unfinished projects in history. Its sheer scale continues to fascinate historians, architects, and engineers. Some admire the boldness of the vision, a symbol of interwar optimism and the belief that technology could conquer any problem. Others view it as a cautionary tale of overconfidence, a reminder that the natural balance of seas and continents cannot be so easily reshaped without unforeseen consequences. The remains of Atlantropa are found not in ruins of construction but in archives. Maps of a shrunken Mediterranean, diagrams of vast dams, and imagined cities on land that never emerged. In these visions, Europe and Africa are joined, the sea reshaped into a tool for civilization. It is a picture of a future that never arrived, but one that reveals how deeply human beings dream of mastering their environment. As an unfinished project, Atlantropa reminds us of the thin line between vision and impossibility. It could have changed history, not only in physical geography but in the political and social structures of two continents. Instead, it lives on as an extraordinary what-if, a testament to the scale of imagination that the 20th century sometimes allowed, and to the limits of turning dreams into stone, steel, and water. The Winchester Mystery House expansions. In the heart of San Jose, California, stands one of the strangest houses in the world. A mansion that grew without plan or order, expanding for nearly 4 decades until it became a labyrinth of endless rooms, staircases, and corridors. Known today as the Winchester Mystery House, it is more than an architectural oddity. It is the remnant of one of history's most unusual unfinished projects. Its expansions, driven not by engineering necessity but by personal obsession and belief, created a structure that was never completed and perhaps never could have been. The story begins with Sarah Winchester, widow of William Wirt Winchester, heir to the fortune of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. In the late 19th century, after the death of her husband and infant daughter, Sarah inherited immense wealth. Yet her life was marked by grief and solitude. Legend holds that she consulted spiritualists, who told her that the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles would haunt her unless she built a house for them, a house that could never be finished. Whether or not she truly believed this tale, Sarah Winchester began construction on her San Jose mansion in 1884, and it continued almost without pause until her death in 1922. What emerged was not a conventional mansion but an architectural puzzle. Workers built day and night, adding new rooms, tearing down sections, and reconstructing them in ever stranger forms. The house expanded to 7 stories at its peak, though much of it was later reduced by the earthquake of 1906. Still, it contained hundreds of rooms, dozens of fireplaces, and miles of corridors. Stairs led to ceilings, doors opened into walls, and hallways ended abruptly in voids. Windows looked into other rooms, and chimneys stopped short of the roof. The house seemed designed to confuse, as though it followed a logic that defied reason. These endless expansions turned the mansion into a place of legend. Some claimed Sarah was building to appease restless spirits, ensuring that the construction never stopped so that she could avoid their wrath. Others believed she sought to create a labyrinth that would trap or mislead the spirits, allowing her to live in peace. Historians, however, note that Sarah may simply have found in construction a form of therapy, a way to channel her grief and wealth into something tangible. Regardless of the reason, the house became her life's work, absorbing her resources and shaping her legacy. The Winchester house was never truly finished. Every hallway, every staircase seemed to suggest the possibility of further building. Carpentry was ongoing until the very day of Sarah's death, when workers laid down their tools and the house froze in place, forever incomplete. Unlike other unfinished projects, halted by lack of funds or political will, the Mystery House stopped only when its creator could no longer continue. In that sense, its incompletion is part of its essence, a physical record of a vision that had no final form. The expansions of the Winchester House also reflect a unique inversion of architectural purpose. Most great projects are designed with clear goals, to serve religion, politics, or progress. Cathedrals rise to honor the divine, towers proclaim power, bridges connect communities. The Winchester Mansion, by contrast, seems to have been built not to serve the living, but to address the dead. Its endless additions did not create utility or grandeur. They created confusion, mystery, and uncertainty. In this way, it became architecture shaped by belief and imagination rather than by practicality. Today, the Winchester Mystery House stands as both museum and monument. Visitors walk through its maze of rooms, marveling at its peculiar features. Guides point to staircases that rise only a few steps before meeting a ceiling, or to doors that open onto sudden drops. The sense of strangeness is heightened by the knowledge that all of this was deliberate, or at least tolerated, by its owner. The house tells no single story, but many, of grief, of wealth, of superstition, and of the human need to give shape to loss through action, however irrational. As an unfinished project, the Winchester Mystery House differs from the grand engineering schemes of towers, bridges, or rockets. It was never intended to change the world or reshape nations. Yet in its own way, it did alter history by becoming one of the most enduring architectural curiosities of the modern age. Its incompletion is not a failure but the point itself, a project that existed to be endless, and in being left unfinished, remains true to its purpose. The mansion remains open to the public, carefully preserved as both a tourist attraction and a cultural artifact. Every addition, every hallway without end, reminds us that projects do not always strive toward closure. Sometimes, the very act of continuing, of refusing to finish, becomes the meaning. Sarah Winchester's endless expansions gave form to her inner world, and their unfinished nature continues to fascinate. In the long history of unfinished projects, the Winchester Mystery House stands apart. It was not stopped by war or by lack of technology or by loss of funding. It stopped only because its creator's life ended. It remains a physical embodiment of endlessness, a place where completion was never the goal, and where the unfinished has become eternal. Project Xanadu. In the history of unfinished projects, few are as paradoxical as Project Xanadu. Unlike towers of stone or canals of earth, it was not meant to reshape landscapes or cities. Instead, it aimed to change the way people stored, accessed, and shared knowledge itself. Conceived long before the internet became reality, Project Xanadu promised a new architecture for information. A vision so far ahead of its time that it never reached completion, and yet it continues to echo through the technologies we use today. The project began in 1960 when Ted Nelson, then a graduate student, set out to design a universal system of hypertext. His idea was simple in concept but revolutionary in scope: to create a digital library where all written knowledge could be stored, linked, and preserved in a way that reflected the true complexity of human thought. Unlike linear text on a printed page, hypertext would allow users to follow connections, branch into related ideas, and explore knowledge as a web rather than a line. Nelson imagined something far greater than the fragmented web that later emerged. In his vision, all documents would exist within a single, interconnected system. Nothing would ever be lost or overwritten. Every version would remain accessible. Quotations would be linked back to their sources through transclusions, ensuring that credit and context were preserved. Information would not merely be copied but woven together, creating a living fabric of human knowledge. This idea was breathtaking, but it demanded technology that did not yet exist. In the 1960s and 1970s, computers were large, costly machines, accessible only to universities and governments. Storage was limited, processing power was small, and the notion of a global network was barely imaginable. Yet Nelson pressed forward, convinced that his system would one day redefine how people interacted with information. Over the decades, Project Xanadu grew in ambition but faltered in execution. Nelson and his collaborators struggled to turn concepts into working code. The project passed through different teams and prototypes, but it was never finished. At times, Nelson's vision became so elaborate that it overwhelmed the practical task of building it. What was meant to be a tool for clarity often turned into a labyrinth of design decisions, specifications, and revisions. By the 1980s and 1990s, as personal computers spread and the Internet began to take shape, Project Xanadu remained unfinished. Meanwhile, others were building simpler systems. The World Wide Web, created by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, offered a lightweight, accessible way to connect documents across the Internet. Its simplicity made it practical, and its openness made it universal. While Nelson criticized the web as a crude imitation of his dream, it spread rapidly, becoming the foundation of the digital age. In this way, Project Xanadu became a symbol of unrealized potential. Its ideas were grander, more protective of authorship, and more ambitious in scope than the web that replaced it. But they were also heavier, slower, and less adaptable to the technologies of the time. The web triumphed because it worked, while Xanadu remained a vision, too complex to be realized with the tools available. Yet it would be a mistake to call Project Xanadu a failure. Many of the principles Nelson proposed, nonlinear navigation, embedded links, source attribution, influenced generations of thinkers and programmers. Even if his system was never built in full, the concepts behind it shaped the development of digital information. The very word hypertext, coined by Nelson, entered the language and became the foundation of the Internet. Today, Project Xanadu is remembered as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. It shows how ideas can be too far ahead of their time, demanding tools and infrastructures that do not yet exist. It also reveals how unfinished projects can still cast long shadows, influencing developments that surpass them in practice. In the history of unfinished projects that might have changed the world, Xanadu is unique. Unlike stone towers or abandoned canals, it left no ruins. Instead, it survives as an unrealized blueprint, an unfinished architecture of thought. It reminds us that human ambition is not limited to physical monuments. It can also reach into the realm of ideas, seeking to reshape how we think, connect, and remember. Project Xanadu was never completed, but its legacy endures in the digital networks that now span the globe. In its incompleteness lies its paradox. It failed to reshape history directly, yet it anticipated the very transformations that define our present. The Ryugyong Hotel. In the heart of Pyongyang stands a building that was meant to symbolize progress, ambition, and modernity, yet has instead become one of the world's most haunting unfinished projects. The Ryugyong Hotel, often called the Hotel of Doom, rises like a jagged pyramid of concrete above the North Korean capital. Conceived in the 1980s as a triumph of socialist architecture and national pride, it has instead remained for decades a monument to incompletion, visible to millions yet functionally empty. The story begins in 1987, when North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, announced plans to build the tallest hotel in the world. The Cold War was still shaping global competition, and in East Asia, prestige was measured not only in military strength but also in architecture and engineering. At the time, South Korea had just unveiled its modern high-rise towers ahead of the 1988 Seoul Olympics, showcasing its economic success. For the North, locked in isolation and struggling economically, there was an urgent desire to answer with a project of equal or greater grandeur. The Ryugyong Hotel was designed as a 105-story skyscraper, reaching a height of 330 meters. Its pyramidal form was both symbolic and practical, giving it stability while allowing for hundreds of rooms, restaurants, and entertainment spaces. According to official announcements, the hotel would contain around 3,000 rooms, multiple revolving restaurants at its peak, and the most luxurious facilities ever constructed in the country. It was intended to be a showcase to the outside world, a sign that North Korea could match and even surpass its rivals. Construction began quickly, carried out by state resources with little transparency. The project, however, faced enormous obstacles. North Korea lacked the technological expertise and building materials necessary for such a vast undertaking. Much of the specialized equipment had to be imported, straining the country's already fragile economy. Even more critically, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s deprived North Korea of crucial support. Funding disappeared, trade shrank, and the nation entered a period of famine and hardship. By 1992, construction of the Ryugyong Hotel ground to a halt. The concrete shell of the structure stood completed, but it lacked windows, interior systems, and the mechanical infrastructure necessary to make it usable. For years, the building remained a hollow pyramid looming over Pyongyang, its bare frame exposed to the elements. International observers began to call it the Hotel of Doom, a title that captured its eerie presence and the sense of failure it projected. For more than a decade, the Ryugyong Hotel stood untouched. It was so conspicuous that, for a time, North Korean authorities removed it from official photographs and city maps, as though attempting to hide the embarrassment of such a colossal, unfinished project. Yet the structure itself could not be erased. Visible from almost every point in the city, it became a silent reminder of ambitions left unrealized. In the 2000s, there were renewed efforts to revive the project. An Egyptian telecommunications company, Orascom, invested in North Korea and offered to assist in completing the hotel's exterior. By 2011, glass panels covered the concrete skeleton, transforming its appearance from a ruin into a seemingly modern skyscraper. The building now glimmered in the Pyongyang skyline, its sharp triangular form reflecting light. For a moment, it seemed that the project might finally be completed. Yet even after the exterior was sealed, the interior remained largely unfinished. Reports suggested that the building lacked electricity, plumbing, and the infrastructure needed to support its intended capacity. Occasional announcements from North Korean officials hinted at imminent opening dates, but none came to pass. At times, lights and LED displays illuminated the outside of the structure, projecting propaganda images and patriotic slogans across its surface. But behind the glass walls, the hotel remained empty, silent, and unused. The Ryugyong Hotel embodies the paradox of unfinished projects. It was not abandoned in obscurity, nor was it destroyed. Instead, it continues to dominate the cityscape, visible proof of an ambition that exceeded capacity. For North Korea, it remains both a source of embarrassment and a tool of propaganda. To the outside world, it is a symbol of how political ambition can drive projects beyond the limits of practicality. Architecturally, the Ryugyong is fascinating. Its pyramidal form, tapering to a sharp point, gives it an almost otherworldly presence. Unlike most skyscrapers, which rise as vertical towers, the Ryugyong spreads upward in three sweeping wings that converge at the top. The design is unique, yet the building itself has never fulfilled its intended purpose. It is a completed shell without function, an exterior without an interior. The hotel also serves as a reminder of the geopolitical tensions of its time. It was conceived not as a practical economic venture, but as a statement of rivalry, an attempt to prove superiority in the contest between North and South Korea. Its failure reflects the larger struggles of North Korea during the late 20th century, when isolation, economic crisis, and political rigidity prevented many of its ambitions from becoming reality. Today, the Ryugyong Hotel still stands, its glass facade gleaming over Pyongyang, but its halls remain empty. It is not merely an unfinished building. It is an unfinished vision of modernity itself. In its silence, it tells the story of ambition outrunning resources, of promises that could not be kept, and of a nation's desire to project strength even as its foundations crumbled. In the history of unfinished projects that could have changed the world, the Ryugyong Hotel occupies a singular place. It is not ancient, nor is it mythological. It is real, modern, and still present. Yet it exists as a monument to incompletion, a vast shell of glass and concrete that towers above a city but contains nothing inside. The Ryugyong Hotel is more than a building. It is a symbol of what happens when vision is divorced from capability, when appearance overtakes substance. And like many unfinished projects, it remains frozen in time, not destroyed, not completed, but suspended between ambition and reality. The dome over Manhattan. In the mid-20th century, When technology and optimism seemed capable of reshaping the modern world, the visionary architect and inventor Buckminster Fuller proposed one of the most extraordinary urban projects ever imagined: a vast transparent dome that would cover much of Manhattan. This project, which became known simply as the Dome over Manhattan, was never realized, but it captured a unique moment in history when architecture, science, and imagination were entwined in bold visions of the future. Fuller, already famous for his invention of the geodesic dome, saw the dome not as an experimental structure, but as a solution to pressing environmental and social challenges. His geodesic designs were efficient, lightweight, and incredibly strong, capable of spanning large distances with minimal materials. By the 1960s, he believed that such engineering principles could be scaled up to enclose entire cities. The proposal for Manhattan envisioned a dome stretching 2 miles in diameter and rising over the island like a transparent shield. Constructed of lightweight materials, likely acrylic or other plastics supported by a geodesic framework, the dome would have been strong enough to withstand wind, snow, and weather. It would cover much of central New York City, enclosing neighborhoods, streets, and skyscrapers within its massive span. The purpose of this dome was both practical and visionary. Fuller argued that it could control the climate inside, maintaining a temperate environment year-round. Snow would never settle on the streets. Rainfall could be managed and purified. Heating and cooling demands would be drastically reduced. He calculated that the energy saved by protecting Manhattan from extreme weather would more than offset the cost of construction. By enclosing the city, pollution could also be controlled, filtered, and reduced, creating a cleaner urban environment for millions of inhabitants. Beyond its environmental benefits, the dome carried symbolic weight. At a time when the Cold War fostered anxieties about the future, Fuller's dome represented hope, the possibility of building technology not for destruction but for protection and sustainability. It was an image of a new relationship between humans and their cities, one where architecture merged with ecology to create self-sustaining environments. Yet the project was never more than a proposal. The sheer scale of the engineering challenge was immense. To build a structure 2 miles across and hundreds of meters high would have required materials, logistics, and techniques that were only beginning to exist. The cost, too, would have been astronomical, especially at a time when urban budgets were strained and public opinion was skeptical of such futuristic ideas. Moreover, the social and political realities of New York City in the 1960s made such a project almost impossible. The city was complex, fragmented, and burdened with competing interests. Convincing millions of residents to live beneath a transparent dome, however visionary, would have required extraordinary consensus. To many, the idea seemed impractical, if not fantastical. Critics dismissed it as utopian speculation, disconnected from the daily challenges of urban life. As a result, the dome over Manhattan remained a concept, presented in drawings, lectures, and essays but never attempted. Fuller, undeterred, continued to promote his broader ideas of Spaceship Earth, the vision that humanity was a crew aboard a single fragile planet, and that new technologies could sustain and protect it. In that sense, the Manhattan Dome was less a building plan than a symbolic gesture, illustrating how radical rethinking might solve environmental and social problems. Over time, the dome became one of the most famous what-ifs in the history of architecture. It is often cited as an example of megastructure thinking, the tendency, especially in the mid-20th century, to imagine vast constructions that would fundamentally alter human life. Alongside space colonies, underwater cities, and arcologies, Fuller's dome reflected the optimism of an age that believed technology could solve nearly any problem. Even in its absence, the dome over Manhattan continues to influence thought. Urban planners, environmentalists, and architects still study Fuller's calculations, noting how he anticipated concerns about climate control, energy efficiency, and sustainability decades before they became central to global debate. His dome, though unrealized, pointed toward a future in which cities might be reimagined not just as places of buildings and streets, but as holistic environments integrated with technology and nature. Today, looking back, the dome over Manhattan feels both impossible and prophetic. Impossible because of its sheer scale, cost, and social complexity. Prophetic because the issues Fuller sought to address, climate change, energy efficiency, pollution, remain among the greatest challenges of our time. His dome was unfinished, but its questions remain. How can humanity create environments that protect, sustain, and nurture life on a crowded planet? As with many unfinished projects, the dome over Manhattan endures not as a failure, but as a vision. It was never built, yet it reshaped the imagination of what cities might become. In drawings and ideas, it still hovers over New York, a transparent shell that could have changed history, but remains instead an emblem of human ambition reaching beyond the practical limits of its era. Disney's experimental prototype community of tomorrow. In the mid-20th century, few figures symbolized imagination and progress as much as Walt Disney. Known around the world for his films, theme parks, and iconic characters, Disney was also a dreamer of cities. Toward the end of his life, he conceived one of his most ambitious projects, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, or Epcot City. It was not intended to be a theme park but a fully functioning community, a model for how technology, design, and organization could reshape urban life. The idea emerged in the 1960s as Disney was planning what would eventually become Walt Disney World in Florida. Unlike Disneyland in California, which was primarily an entertainment park, the Florida project was envisioned on a much larger scale, with room for experimentation beyond attractions. Disney was increasingly interested in the problems of modern cities: traffic congestion, urban sprawl, pollution, and social fragmentation. He believed that, with the right planning and the newest technology, these problems could be solved. Epcot was to be a city of the future, housing around 20,000 residents. At its center would stand a vast, climate-controlled dome covering a hub of commerce, business, and culture. Radiating outward, residential neighborhoods would be arranged in carefully designed patterns, connected by efficient transportation systems. Cars would be largely removed from the surface. Instead, people would travel by underground service roads, monorails, and the People Mover, a continuously running public transport system. Disney emphasized that Epcot was not intended to be a static community but an experimental laboratory. New technologies would be introduced and tested there before being rolled out to the wider world. Housing would be constantly updated, appliances modernized, and infrastructure redesigned as innovations emerged. Residents would not own their homes in the traditional sense but would live in spaces that evolved with the city itself. In Disney's words, it would be a living blueprint of the future. The vision was bold, and it reflected both the optimism and the anxieties of its era. The 1960s were a time of rapid technological change, when computers, automation, and space exploration promised to reshape daily life. Yet cities were facing pollution, poverty, and unrest. Disney believed his Epcot could serve as a solution, a place where order, cleanliness, and innovation replaced the chaos of traditional urban life. But the project also raised questions. Epcot was to be governed not as a democratic municipality but as a corporate community, overseen by Disney's company. Residents would live in a world where every element was planned and controlled, from transportation to architecture to household design. Supporters saw this as efficiency. Critics worried it resembled a carefully managed showcase rather than a real city. In 1966, Walt Disney presented his plans in a short promotional film, outlining the details of Epcot with the confidence and charm that had made him a household name. He described it as his most important project, one that would outlast his entertainment empire. But only months later, in December of the same year, Disney passed away. Without his leadership, the company was uncertain how to continue such an enormous and unconventional undertaking. After his death, Disney's successors decided to scale back the vision. The Florida project went forward, but instead of building Epcot City, the company focused on creating Walt Disney World as a resort destination. Years later, in 1982, Epcot was opened, but as a theme park rather than a functioning community. It celebrated innovation and international culture, with attractions and pavilions, but it was not the experimental city Walt Disney had imagined. The unfinished Epcot City remains one of the most intriguing what-ifs in urban history. Had it been built, it might have offered valuable lessons in technology, sustainability, and planning. It might also have revealed the limits of centralized control in human communities. Instead, it exists only in models, films, and Disney's own words, a dream that was set aside when its creator was no longer there to guide it. Yet the influence of Epcot City continues. Many of its ideas, pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods, integrated transit systems, and sustainable design, have reappeared in modern urban planning. Concepts that once seemed futuristic are now discussed in the context of smart cities and sustainable development. In this way, Epcot's unfinished story reflects a broader truth. Even projects that are never built can shape how people imagine the future. Epcot City was not abandoned because it was impossible. It was abandoned because its guiding visionary was no longer there. Without Disney's personal drive and authority, the project lacked the force to move forward. What remains is a striking example of how unfinished projects often depend on individuals as much as on ideas. In the history of unfinished visions that could have changed the world, Epcot City stands as both a monument to imagination and a reminder of fragility. It shows how bold dreams can illuminate possibilities far ahead of their time, even if they never come to pass. Like many unfinished projects, it survives not in stone or steel, but in the imagination. An eternal city of tomorrow that never arrived, yet continues to inspire those who think about what cities might one day become. Ending. And this brings us to the end of our journey through the unfinished projects that could have changed history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about these remarkable stories. And if you know someone who would enjoy this, feel free to share the video with them.